leadership begins with listening. And at least when I got into leadership opportunities in youth ministry, I thought leadership was about getting to tell other people what to do. So when I started to understand that leadership begins with listening, right? Leadership begins with listening. If that first step I talked about is get your team together, make sure you're intentional about who's on that. The second step is discerning where God is leading. I'm going to translate what you said into this process. And I actually coached another youth leader through this recently. Take your team of, 4 or 5 committed people. Make the commitment to go have a conversation each with 2 or 3 people. If you've got 4 people on your team listening to 3 people, you can have 12 conversations very quickly. Ask those people, what do you think the students, teenagers in our church need most?
Yeah.
What hopes or dreams do you have for how they're going to follow Jesus or how their life is going to be formed?
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the show today. Thanks for jumping on, tuning in here and listening wherever you are and wherever this finds you. Thanks for making this podcast today a part of your day. Fantastic interview ahead. We are joined today with Dr. Jake Mulder from Fuller Youth Institute. Brand new book just launched for them on making some changes. Kind of what does the future look like? Kind of future focused church. What does it look like? Listen, as youth pastors, youth ministers, we often are in the second chair role, if that. And so what does that look like then to look forward at the church? Specifically, we're going to dive in here today, talk about a lot of things that we can do when navigating change, kind of how to walk forward and even lay out vision, and some of the essential things that are needed to do that. I believe this conversation today is really, really helpful for you as a youth pastor and youth minister, as you're navigating so many complexities here on the front lines of ministry and student ministry. You're going to be dealing with changes and trying to navigate that from a second chair, often at least. And so knowing how to do that well, man, is going to play into your longevity and your ability to be effective long term. So great interview, lots of things today for you to take note of and put in place and implement there. Very, very practical, actionable interview today. So you'll love that, enjoy that. Before we jump in, if you're not on the mailing list, make sure you head to thelongerhaul.com, jump on the email list there. Got some big news coming soon that'll be coming out and some special opportunities and some invites just for the mailing list and folks that are there on the mailing list. So make sure you head over to thelongerhaul.com. You'll see it right there. Jump on the mailing list for that. And of course, make sure you're following, subscribe to the show, wherever you listen to that, so that you'll get the episodes as they come down. The next few months are going to be a lot of fun, some fun stuff that we've kind of teased in the past that is happening soon. So anyway, make sure you're doing all that. With all of that said and out of the way, we'll jump in here to today's interview with Dr. Jake Mulder.
Welcome to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast, helping you survive and thrive in youth ministry. And now, here's your host, Jody Livingston.
Well, hey, Jake, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule, I'm sure, to jump on the show here with us. I'm really interested in our topic today, and I'm really looking forward to diving in to this idea, particularly, which we've talked about before, even what this means for maybe those who aren't necessarily in a first chair kind of role. Because I think so many times topics like ours today tend to focus on, kind of that first chair leader. So for much of our folks, obviously they're not in that seat. So do this for me before we jump in. Take just a minute, introduce yourself, a little of your background, and how we ended up here today.
Yeah, absolutely, Jody. It's great to be with you. Maybe I should say, so first of all, my name is Jake Mulder. Maybe I should say to your lead-in, though, I don't currently operate as the first chair in my organization. In fact, I work for Fuller Seminary, which has a president and several. So I'm like multiple clicks down in my own organization. So that's probably worth noting. But I am the Assistant Chief of Leadership Formation at Fuller Seminary. So I think a lot about how we train and form people in the world. I also operate as a senior advisor to the Fuller Youth Institute and the 10 by 10 collaboration, which have really core missions and strategies about forming young people, forming and supporting the youth leaders and others who work with young people. I should probably also name my first real full-time job was as a youth pastor, middle school youth pastor.
You've
I have
earned
the
it.
name. Yeah. So, so I've walked in some of these shoes before, but it's great to be with you.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, you're one of us. That's what I'm hearing you say. Yeah.
I think that is a fair way to say it. Yes.
So we're here really talking about. There's a new book that's coming out, and folks who've listened know this. Like this is not a show that just brings on people to promote books. Like obviously, if there's value there, which there is in this case, yes, please go, and I'm going to encourage you to do that throughout. But more the topic is really what matters for me here, and this idea of the future focused church. Maybe just start by kind of defining what does that mean for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So future focused church, we would describe that as it's a group of people. So if the church is anything, it's not just one person, it's a group of people. So if you're thinking like, I am going to lead my church into the future, well, maybe God's going to use you, but it's you and who else? If this is a church, it's a community. So it's a group of people who are discerning the way of Jesus together. To me, that's part of what makes it unique, that it's a church. We're not just together for pickleball or any watching a football game, any random purpose that way. Those are good things to do, but it's when we're coming together to live out the way of Jesus that we have a church that is present. So it's that group of people seeking the way of Jesus together, especially around a few of the areas that we talk about are related to younger people, about what God is doing in terms of people's differences and how the gospel brings people together, and how we can be more loving and engaged in our neighborhood and in our community. But Jody, I would say one of the first phrases that we use in the book is that we believe the best days of the church are ahead. Yeah. And we find that there's often so much bad news or negativity about the church. Now, I'm a researcher. I am not missing all the data and challenge. I'm also a parent, and I live in my community in Michigan, so I don't miss out on the challenges. Those are certainly forefront. But we believe in a God of resurrection who does new things. We believe the Holy Spirit is active. There are times when things are hard. I don't want to skip over that, but we just operate out of an absolutely core belief that the best days of the church are ahead. And in fact, the best days of your church can be ahead.
I appreciate that. I really appreciate that perspective, because I love the world of research. I can go down a pretty big rabbit hole reading all of the new studies that are coming out. And there's so many incredible studies and so much incredible research that's being done. And most of it is very, here's the problems that we're seeing, or here's, especially in student ministry, right? Yep. Here's the rate of dropouts that we're falling, and seeing students leaving the church. We're seeing students failing to engage. Here's how churches are struggling to engage with parent ministry. And look, to your point, yes, all those things are true to an extent. But what are the positives that we're seeing? And I don't know, Jake, if this is true everywhere. It seems to be true with the student guys and the student girls I'm talking to. When you talk to youth ministers across the country right now, and I literally had this conversation with a church member a couple weeks ago. This is my 25th year as a youth pastor. There's just something different in this season of ministry. It feels like there's something stirring, and I can't articulate it as clearly as I'd like to, but there is an openness and hunger, not just to hear spiritual things or be in spiritual conversations, but to literally like walk in submission to that authority. That is so encouraging right now. And when you guys say in kind of that opening, line of the book that the best days are ahead, I think every youth pastor and youth minister listening is like, yeah, we're watching this happen and take place and shape here on the front row of our ministry. Yeah. So I love that.
Yeah. Well, and I would jump off of that, Jody, to say one of the key phrases that we're operating with is, what if we're not just in a season of decline in the church? What if the church is not going away? And I mean, theologically and fundamentally, I believe that God's not letting the church go away. But what if we're not just in this season of decline? What if we're actually in the season of reimagination and renewal? What if God is up to something new in this season? Now, I don't want to skip over the challenges. Boy, if you are working directly with students, I mean, record high rates of anxiety, suicide, depression. Like there are real challenges. We are in a polarized world and society that young people are experiencing every day. There's lots of things that we could talk about in terms of the challenges. There is a decreasing number of people in the United States who identify as Christian. Many pastors, youth leaders, others are expressing very high rates of either stress or burnout. So like, this is where I don't want to skip over those things.
No, for sure.
Like, oh no, the world, like, don't pay attention to those things. The world is amazing. There's some really hard elements of what's happening in the world. And we can look to research. We can look to history. We can look to scripture. I like to look at the Old Testament. If you look at those times and places where Israel in the Old Testament started to say, like, maybe we don't need God. Maybe we can do things on our own. Were those times where, like, things are a little too good, a little too easy. We've just started to lean back a little bit. It's in those times when things are difficult that people actually begin to cry out to God again and say, well, wait a sec, what if we're missing something? That's part of, for me, the season that I think we're in, of people recognizing, yeah, there are some really hard realities. What if God has been present in the midst of all of it?
Yeah.
And if we as a group of people, and why should this not start with students and our teenagers? And often these sorts of things do. This is where, like, you know, we can say, oh, student ministry, we're not in the first chair. I think youth ministry is the innovation arm, the adaptation arm, the where new things come, the energy. I have such belief in ministry happening with children, teenagers, young adults. I think this is part of our moment to say, what if God's actually doing something new with our students, with our children, with our young adults? What if we get to have the front row seat to be part and shape it? If this is that moment of possibility, reimagination, and renewal, well, then amazing things are ahead of us in the next few years. So I think this is an exciting time to be in youth ministry.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, 18-year-old me would be completely overwhelmed with the day in and day out of ministry now. But probably arrogant enough to be like, let's go take it,
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And so I tell people all the time, like, we are dealing with things in our student ministry, conversations that we're having, challenges that we're having to navigate that our adults are not yet even thinking through.
Yep.
And that is an incredible challenge for a youth minister who often, not always, often is newer to ministry, less experienced.
Yep.
And sometimes haven't yet had enough experience to gain wisdom to navigate some of these things that come our way. We're definitely in the front row. There's no question about that. I think you're right. When you think through some of those key challenges, I mean, you just listed a bunch. Are there certain ones that seem to rise to the top in some of the things you're seeing?
Yeah. So this is where I would say, when we think about this book that we've written, and I say we, because I have two co-authors, Kara Powell, who, if you've been around the youth ministry world for a while, you may have heard of Kara Powell, and then Ray Chang, who's the executive director of the 10 by 10 collaboration. There's many reasons that we wrote this book, but a couple of them are, if you think about senior leaders and decision makers in the church, senior pastor, executive pastor, just whatever your role is, we find that many of them care deeply about the future of the church and where it's headed. But some of the areas that we need to focus most are not front of mind or what's most familiar for that senior level decision maker. So yes, when we think about, and I'll get to youth leaders in a second, but when we think about where the church is headed and its future, there is no way of thinking about the future of the church without thinking about young people. But if I'm a senior leader, senior decision maker, and I've said, like, oh, well, young people aren't my responsibility, that's the youth pastor's job, or that's whatever, all of a sudden we've got a disconnect. Because if the people making some of the top decisions are not thinking about some of the most important areas, we've lost something. So on the one hand, if you're listening to this and you've got a senior pastor, this is not just like shameless promotion, Jody. We literally wrote this book to help a youth leader make a case to their senior leader about how important young people are in the present and the future of the church. So that's one challenge that we would point to. Another challenge that we would end up pointing to is, I know so many youth leaders who actually have a sense of what they want to see happen. Like, God has given them a vision, they've got a direction, they have clear desires, they can even articulate those desires. how they realize those desires and how those changes come about in the complexity of a small church, a medium-sized church, a big church, that's a whole nother piece. So this book is meant to help unlock that. If you are a youth leader or a young adult leader, children's pastor, and you have this sense of what to do, but you're like, I just feel like how to make that happen is elusive. I'm getting stuck. I'm busy. I don't have all the time to figure out all these pieces. This book is meant to be a companion for that.
You guys lay out some strategies on that, especially the idea of kind of crafting or creating that vision to communicate. What are some of those strategies that you guys talk through?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the vision, a couple different ways that I could approach this. So I guess I'll start with anytime you're trying to craft a way forward for the future, we think moving into the future is essentially about starting with where you are right now, that you're here, and moving into where God is leading you. We would say that you're there, right? So any change in your whole church, your youth ministry, it's moving from where you are now here to that future reality. You're there. Most youth leaders or pastors that I talk to say, my next step then is just to take action. I need to start running somewhere, and the faster I run, probably the better. That can be the wrong way to think about it, and here's why. If you use your GPS is going to ask you two things. It's going to ask you, where are you starting from and where are you trying to get to? If you are ambiguous or unclear with your GPS, it will not be able to help you. You can't say, I want to go, I don't know, maybe AI will solve this for us, but you can't just say I want to go somewhere and it picks where you're going to go. Yeah. In order to understand how to get there, you have to be so clear about your starting point and your end destination. We find that a lot of pastors, a lot of youth leaders, they're operating with a vague sense of the future. They're operating with a sort of understanding of where they are right now, and they are just running, which means they will move forward, but they might move forward in a big loop that takes them right back to where they are. Or they might move forward and sprint for a few months and then run out of energy. Yeah. The one piece I did not introduce into this, so change is about here, there, how you're going to get in between. But the last piece that we find essential is who is actually part of this journey with you. And so often when we look at Jesus, we see, right, Jesus had the disciples. Jesus is building a team of people who are going to carry on this work. In ministry, it's the building that team for the future is so essential. So we outlined this 4 elements, Jody: here, there, who, and how. I can talk about any one of those pieces more. If you want to go into vision and there, I can do that, but you tell me where you want to go.
Yeah, I think let's talk through how you decide where you're going to go when you're not because here's what happens, and you know this, right?
Yep.
I'm going to tell you what you already know. So many times in student ministry, I think there's a couple things that happen. One, we craft our own vision in a silo that runs, at least at the best, not parallel or congruent, but apart or away from where our church is. Sometimes it's on parallel tracks, but just different altogether. So the vision then that we're crafting doesn't align with underneath the umbrella of the overall church. And it works for a while, but in the end, it doesn't help students move into the larger church at a greater context. So that's the other part. The other thing is, I think, to your point, we don't know really where we're headed or what we want. We just think all of these things in front of us right now are really helpful or good. And so we chase good at the expense of effective.
Yep.
And so one of the things that I've talked about here forever is, man, and I'm not putting this in your language, and if you disagree with this, please, by all means, tell me. 5 years from now, what are the characteristics that you want to see in your students? Let's start with a 5-year plan. Yep. Then let's think about 3 years. What does that look like?
Yep.
Then in a year from now, where do we need to be? And what do I do in the next 6 months? And the reason I think that's helpful, particularly for a youth pastor, is because you rarely in youth ministry see the fruit of your effort until a student is out of your ministry. So if I don't have an idea of where there is, to use your language, I'm going to get a year and a half into this. I'm going to think, oh, well, I'm not there yet. I'm not sure I'm doing anything. I'm going to get really discouraged.
Yep.
So having some of those benchmarks for me is really helpful for me to understand and remind myself, hey, that's okay. I'm not supposed to be there. I'm still on my way there. but we are making progress towards a
Yeah.
clearly defined goal and future.
Yep.
All that to say, I'd love to tackle a little bit of what you guys are thinking through and saying in terms of how do you articulate that then as a youth minister?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so much good stuff there that I resonate with, but to unpack some of it from my vantage point, I think that woven throughout so much of what I heard you say, and I find this so present in a lot of youth ministry, is the silo is the thing that draws many of us to youth ministry in a positive sense, and it is also the thing that will truncate or challenge or tank our work in the end. And here's what I mean by that. When I started off in youth ministry in a staff position, I believe I was 19 years old. And the idea of like, I'm 19, but I've got like my mini kingdom of like a wing of the church that is ours, and programming and all volunteers, a budget, all the things that we're doing. And I mean, Jesus had made a real impact on my life. So out of the best sense of it, I wanted the students, the middle school students in this case, in my ministry. See, I just called it my ministry. The middle school students in the ministry, I wanted them to have that same experience of Jesus that I had. Yeah. And because it's so fresh for me, and because the leaders in my church were like, Jake, you're 19. You know what middle school students need. We're older, like we're supportive of you, but you are the expert in the young people in our church, right? Like, oh man, that did so much for my ego as a 19-year-old. But it created this, again, kingdom is the best way that I can say, like this kingdom that I had set up that was my ministry that I was running. And there is so much about that I want to honor and is good, of the support and the investment and the everything. But if you zoom out for just a second and we focus on, and this is what I heard you do, the young people, the middle school students who are journeying through my ministry, I've got them for 3 years. Yeah. And within those 3 years, I've got them for, I could even count on, back when I was 19, a regular-ish weekly attendance, right? Not once a month or something like that. But I had them for those 3 years. Well, they were formed somehow before they got into 6th grade. They were going to be formed somehow the moment they get out of 8th grade. When I started to zoom out and say, if I really care about serving the students who are in this ministry, I actually need to take the long view of where I want them to be. It took me about 3 years to wake up to that reality. So I was a slow learner on some of those things. But the moment that I did that and say, okay, so if I ultimately want to understand what God is going to do in each of these kids' life, that is not just a me activity. There are others who I should probably talk to and understand. That was a game-changing moment for me. So I've been kind of autobiographical. I am happy to go into, what might that look like and how do we engage it? But anything you want to add before I keep moving on that?
No, I think, it's interesting you say it took you 3 years. I'm convinced that you grow more in your leadership and capacity from year 3 to year 5.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Than in all of your ministry total. The skill set to get from 3 to 5 is very different. So the fact that you say, oh man, it took me 3 years, that totally tracks.
Yep.
Because, and in your case, you're seeing 8th graders now come through and they're leaving and you're going, what have we done? Like, what have we really done? So
absolutely.
I love that.
Yep.
Are there, like, if you were to back away from this idea of defining the there and kind of this roadmap, if you will, or like, what are the things that are most essential to know? Like, what would you say if you sat down, if you had coffee, if you and I were having coffee and you're saying, okay, I'm telling you, I just need to figure out where I'm going and headed. What are the things that you're going to say, okay, here's kind of 3 things or the most important things that you need to work through?
If I were to boil it down to a few pieces and, what would I have said to like 19 or 22-year-old me, right? If I'm having coffee, the very first, and I would say most important thing is making sure I've got a committed group of people who are on this journey with me, who are, I'm going to say, not just the usual suspects. And here's what I mean by that. Yeah. 19-year-old me would have chosen who's my age, who thinks like me, who I'm probably friends with, and the four of us would have created an echo chamber together on what we thought needed to happen.
Yeah.
So when I say a group of people, I'm not just saying a couple volunteers who show up most of the time. I am thinking through who's going to understand the perspective of what's happening in a student's life and a perspective of the church more broadly. I would imagine you're going to land with at least one parent of one of those teenagers. You're probably going to land on somebody who has broader purview and perspective in the wider church. It could be your supervisor. It could be an elder or deacon or board member. It could just be a 70-year-old in the church who's really wise, whose perspective that you trust. And then, I don't know, maybe it's one of your volunteers, or maybe it's a mature student, high school student that you have or something. But to actually say, I want this to be more than just a me-centered youth ministry. I don't want it to just be, I came in for a few years, left my mark, and then hopefully somebody does it. That's the first piece that I would say, is just be so intentional about who you are gathering to help you discern. And I'm using that word intentionally, discern this work. Make sure they operate and come from a variety of different backgrounds and perspectives, because then the moment that you start to have that conversation of, so what's the vision that we have for our ministry? You are going to start to ask those questions in an entirely different way. So that would be piece one. Anything you want to say on that before I go into piece two? Okay. So piece two, if the first thing, and I guess I just want to be really practical of, those people may be more than just a single text or a, hey, can you show up tomorrow at lunch conversation. I would encourage you to think carefully and practically. We give some resources in the book on how to build that team and who to think through. These are likely people who may not be regular youth group volunteers, but they have wisdom and perspective to offer. So lots of different ways we can unlock those gifts. After you've got that group of people who you trust and you really value the different perspectives that they're going to offer, we see vision as really having a couple of steps to it. The first step is just making sure you're actually discerning where God is taking you. So it's not just, how do I create mini versions of me? It's not just, what does the church up the street do, or whoever I saw, on Instagram or what have you. It's in our local context. Where do we think God is leading? We give some exercises for that in the book. One of my favorite is actually learning from Scripture. So we interact through our research with this one church where they were trying to say, like, who do we want to be 5 years from now? And they were a little stuck on the question. And when they thought about who do they want to be, we had given them an exercise to say, take every member of your team, have them outside of a meeting all reflect on what is a passage of Scripture that you think should really define your church or your ministry 5 years from now. In their case, they all landed on the parable of the prodigal son. And if you know the story, in the parable of the prodigal son, the younger son, right, ends up drifting, journeying away, comes back to the family. The father, who represents God, ends up running to the son, throws his arms around him, and throws a party. And then the older brother's frustrated about the party, so the older brother doesn't join the party. Well, this church said, and by the way, the pastor had told us, like, and we were kind of a legalistic, judgmental church. But the team ended up saying, what if we as a church became the sort of church that any time someone who is far from God comes back to God, we just throw a party and we celebrate. We don't point fingers. We don't get frustrated. We don't get judgmental. Now, I'm talking about a wider church, their vision. I might wonder, instead of trying to be so innovative and creative and come up with your cool statement and name for what you want your ministry to be, what if you were actually drawing from some examples and grounding in Scripture and letting that inform who you want to be as a ministry or as a church? There are a number of ways that you can discern who you want to be. I would also encourage you, yes, I think you already mentioned this, make sure you're tying it to who your church is overall. I had a conversation with a youth leader recently. He had come up with this great half-page description of, like, the youth ministry vision, who they want to be. But here was the challenge. Their church has a really strong identity. Like, if you ask almost anybody in the church, like, what do we value in this church? They have worked on clear set of values, clear mission, clear direction, etc. So when I said to the youth pastor, I was like, hey, the moment that you start to move in this direction, everyone's going to notice you're not using any of the language from your wider church. that would have been noticed in that church. And that would, so like, sometimes we almost work too hard. I'm not saying you just need to duplicate exactly who your church is, but finding the right ways to reflect what matters most. That may be from scripture. I'll pause there for a moment.
Yeah, I love that. So when I came on staff here, one of the things that I loved about this church from the jump was the longevity of our team. So many people had been on staff for 20, 30 years, which was great. And there was a ton of what you're saying, the very defined language, very purposeful language, which was great. But there were also some things that we used often that felt inconsistent.
Yep.
And I think, again, I'm new. I don't know. So I started asking, hey, we keep saying, I've been in so many meetings now. I'm a few weeks in. You keep using this word, but it doesn't seem consistent with how you define this word, right?
Yep.
So then on my front, just really through asking questions, not as wise as it may sound at this point, I just began asking questions that then helped shape and bring clarity to what the use of some of that terminology would look like in the future, particularly around my area of students.
Yep.
And so it wasn't reinventing the wheel. I didn't have to go and create I kind of already had an idea of where I felt like things should go. The question is, and how does this fit in a larger scope?
Yeah.
When I started looking around and understanding the greater context, we're kind of doing that, just not as clearly as I think we could be. So let me take existing language and then help clarify that and set rails for what that looks like then in the student world.
One of the phrases we use in the book, because I heard you say this in a few different ways, one of the phrases that we use in the book is that leadership begins with listening. Leadership begins with listening. And at least when I got into leadership opportunities in youth ministry, I thought leadership was about getting to tell other people what to do. So when I started to understand that leadership begins with listening, right? Leadership begins with listening. If that first step I talked about is get your team together, make sure you're intentional about who's on that. The second step is discerning where God is leading. I'm going to translate what you said into this process. And I actually coached another youth leader through this recently. Take your team of, 4 or 5 committed people. Make the commitment to go have a conversation each with 2 or 3 people. If you've got 4 people on your team listening to 3 people, you can have 12 conversations very quickly. Ask those people, what do you think the students, teenagers in our church need most?
Yeah.
What hopes or dreams do you have for how they're going to follow Jesus or how their life is going to be formed? This youth leader who I worked with recently, he and his team did that. They had 4 of them, 5 of them had conversations with about 3 people. That included a few parents. It included a couple of the pastoral staff. It included an elder deacon. It included a few teenagers. What they noticed, they heard a lot of consistency in what they heard across those 12 people. So when they started to create their vision, they just started to weave together, what are some of those things that we heard? And then the moment that they started to share it out, everybody that they talked to was like, you heard me. I mean, the senior pastor's like, you listened to what I said. And it wasn't that the youth pastor didn't have to give up anything that, she cared about most. But so much of this ends up being about language. So I'll use that to point to, I said, first thing, get your team together. Second thing, make sure you discern where God is leading. The third thing, often we don't do as good of a job communicating these things as we need to. Yeah. And I have often found that in youth ministry, we can operate, we're moving quickly. We can operate with like what's assumed or, of course people know this, or I sent it out in an email or something. So I'm sure we made an announcement about it. We spend time in our process of driving change and moving forward, talking about you need to discern where God is leading, but then you actually need to craft that into language. It could be a half page. It could be 1 page. We give some specific advice to do that. But until you can make it memorable, people grasp it, you actually share it enough that it begins to be socialized, it can remain as a mystery. It can be something that, the importance of communicating it and communicating it clearly, regularly, intentionally. I just can't say enough about that, because if it's not communicated, all of a sudden youth ministry just gets kind of tucked away over here in the corner, and it doesn't give people the ability. one really tangible example of that, Jody, and another church that I was working with, we ended up doing some of this work, clarifying where we thought God was leading, communicating what was happening. But then we wanted to give people the chance to get involved in the ministry. And so the youth leader was able to make an announcement from stage on a Sunday morning. And then they just had a super short survey that people could reply to on their phones. Maybe a survey is right for your church, maybe it's not. But it invited people to get involved in a couple of ways. One was, do you want to become a youth ministry volunteer? The other way was, are you open to walking with, mentoring, or otherwise discipling a teenager? And this was a medium-sized church. What was really interesting, they only had 1 or 2 people who replied to, I want to be a youth group volunteer. They had about 30 people who signed up saying, I want to mentor, I want to walk with, I want to disciple. To me, it just spoke to people had such a strong understanding of like whatever their picture of youth ministry was. And you and I get the sense we're a little older, right? Like we could run through our history and our Rolodex of what youth ministry expectations there may be. But it started to open up some adults' perspective in the congregation when they were like, wait, there's a way I can invest in teenagers that is not only show up to youth group every week. There were a lot of adults who were excited about that, but it was offering them a slightly different way to engage.
Yeah, I love that. I encourage, as I'm coaching through, especially youth ministers struggling to get volunteers, right? And it's typically because, even to your point of what you just said, we have one avenue to plug in, and it's a small group leader, right? Or a Sunday school teacher. And so I will just say, man, you need some on-ramp opportunities for folks, because not everybody is built to be that. So I think, that's so important. If you're listening and you have one avenue for people to engage, you're missing out on so many other people. And if you're only recruiting older volunteers because you're too young to drive the rental car, that's a problem as well. You need people in some context, going back even to kind of your point about forming the team. Be mindful that if you are hired on or into your church through a search team or search committee, a lot of times that team or that search committee, they're made up of the kind of the inner circle of people who are most passionate about youth ministry. They may not represent, well-meaning, but they may not represent the view of the church as a whole. And so you may have diversity in age in that context, but not diversity in experience or focus. So reaching outside of that, man, that is such an important component for you as a listener to recognize that you need people. I used to invite people who I knew were supportive but opinionated. Those are the people I wanted in my circle. It made me a better youth pastor because I had to stop and think through, okay, what are they going to ask that I need to have an answer to?
Well, and Jody, you mentioned this earlier of thinking through what is it that young people are going to need most. I haven't read every translation of the Bible, but there's, as far as I'm aware, there's no translation of the Bible that says youth ministry is the most important thing that young people need. I'm not opposed to youth ministry. I'm not against, but like specifically youth group. I don't know of a translation of the Bible that says, ye shall have a youth group for students. Youth group is an amazing, at one point, innovation. It does some really great things. Young people need peer support. We spent a lot of time in this book, before this book, part of the Fuller Youth Institute's work, asking what is it that young people need most? And the shortest way that we can put it is that, youth group is great. It's a good thing. It's a bonus. I hope young people are part of a good youth group. We think what young people need most is relational discipleship that's radically focused on Jesus. Relational discipleship radically focused on Jesus. And if you start with that assumption, like what did Jesus do? Jesus walked with people. He reflected the way of God to them and invited them to live out that way. If we've got young people today who are saying, I'm lonely, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, I'm unsure, people are trying to sell me things all the time, my world is changing, what do they need most? Consistent, invested adults who live the way of Jesus and walk with them. Boy, if you start from that vantage point and say, okay, I'm the youth pastor, my job is helping my church form and invest in young people, what do they need most? Adults and others who are going to relationally invest and journey with them and model Christ. Okay, so then your job is, how do I implement that? That might look exactly like the youth group. Like a lot of youth groups are great containers for that to happen, and all the trips and retreats and things that we do. And there's a lot of it that we keep a certain set of activities, programs, and industry going. It gets students to show up. It doesn't go back. So asking that question about that thing that matters most, and hey, I don't know your context. Ask it for your students, right? But keep pushing. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, listen. We're the same. We're on the same soapbox. Okay. We're in it together. And if people are listening, they're with us, whether they want to be or not.
Yes.
Okay. So there's three things. Is there a fourth or?
Okay. What I would maybe say is the fourth is there's a way of going about this that's you've built a team. They're committed. They're helping you vision where things should go. You've really discerned where you feel like God is leading. You've taken the process of communicating that and helping share it. To me, that's actually where the fun begins, right? So this is the question of like, where would you start versus where would you go next? Because there's a scenario that what you end up sharing, your wider congregation and community is like, yeah, that's what we're going to do. And then there's a scenario where people are like, no, that's not what I picture, right? And so the book and the research we've done is on change, right? So there are 1,000,001 good books out there, like a lot of good books about youth ministry and what we should do. I will name, from my own background, the Fuller Youth Institute. Sticky Faith is dated, but it is still good. Yep. I co-authored a book called Growing Young. That is about what youth ministry in the church should look like on behalf of young people. This is a book on change. And so often what we find, Jody, is you as a youth leader, you may have followed God faithfully. You may have worked with a team to discern what is needed. And what God is asking you to do in your church is actually challenging some people's assumptions and asking them to do some things differently. So, man, what is my fourth? It is now walk the journey of faithfulness to what God has called you. But that might mean needing to bring about and drive some change in your area of ministry, in other areas of the church. I'll say this and then I'll stop. So often, I think as a youth leader, it's easy to say, oh, it's my job to disciple students. Like that is what I was hired for. And I don't think that's it. I think you are the advocate. You are the person to help the rest of the church and community come around and invest. So as you start to discern what do young people need most, and you get a vision for that and you're ready to communicate it, now you actually need to drive that taking place. And as the world has changed and ministry has changed, that may mean some changes for your church. So I got a whole lot to say about that, but I know we only have so much time. So I'll let you drive where we go from here.
I love that. And you don't do it all at once, right? Like the worst thing you do is like, that's it. We're changing it all because that's how you get fired. And then the next person comes in and starts over and disassembles everything you've worked to build. I love the process. I love the steps. I know that the book lays out much more on that. If you had to say, someone listening buys the book, right? And they read the book, and at the end of it, if you could say, man, here's one step, one action step that you would want them to take from that, what would that be?
Yeah, I'm going to, so especially if I'm thinking of a youth leader, right? What can I do as a youth leader? I'm going to combine two parts from the book into one. So here's my dual step. I'm going to get a twofer in here.
It's a real pastor move, by the way.
I know. So Ron Heifetz is a change expert. And one of the statements that he uses, he says, when it comes to change, you have to fail people's expectations at a rate that they can stand. Okay. When it comes to change, you have to fail people's expectations at a rate that they can stand. And he says, if you bring about change too quickly, I mean, that's when you either burn out, you get pushed out, you have made people too upset, too uncomfortable. So for a lot of youth leaders, you just cannot move too quickly. All right, sorry, you do move too quickly and it ends up causing all sorts of problems. The other piece is if you never make change and you move so slowly, that change never comes. So making sure you are staying keenly aware to the community that you are in, how people are ready to move forward and moving at that speed. And to land that tangibly, Jody, one of the best ways that I see to do that, we write about in the book, the idea of experimenting from the edges. Okay, experimenting from the edges. And part of what we mean by that is instead of, you can spend time on this change and you come up with a logo and a website and you've got a congregational announcement and all this stuff. But then that becomes your one shot of like, hopefully this goes well. And if it doesn't, like, it doesn't work. So this idea of experimenting from the edges, find small, safe places where you can try something and you can fail. One youth leader we know who we write about in the book, his name is Keegan. Keegan really wanted to see his church move towards more intergenerational ministry and connection between younger and older people. He was tempted to move for some like large programmatic solutions. And what he ended up seeing was, okay, that's not going to work in our church. I think he was in fact told no by his supervisor. Like, we're not going to do that. And so he said, well, what do I have control over? And he had control over the mission trip, the youth mission trip. And he said, okay, we almost always just do youth on a mission trip with a few adult volunteers or sponsors. He said, what if we invite, 20 of the students who are going to go on the mission trip? What if we intentionally invite like 5 adults from across the age spectrum who aren't just there to be volunteers? They're actually there to like do work alongside of us. And at one of the trainings, one of the adults basically raised their hand and said, like, how much are we going to have to interact with the teenagers? Right? Like that was the question in the training when you're maybe not off to a good start. But after spending a week together and serving together and having that experience, this adult who was kind of known throughout the congregation as not like pro and in favor, when Sunday worship rolled around a week later, this guy's like giving high fives to teenagers and talking during the greeting time. And everybody's like taking notice. What happened over there? And it was because the youth leader had said, okay, I'm going to look for a smaller experiment that if it doesn't go well, it's not that everything falls apart. If it does go well, we can build on it. Look for those ways that you can experiment from the edges and learn your way into it.
I love that. If folks want to connect with you, what's the easiest way for them to find you?
So one would just be Fuller Youth Institute website. Google Fuller Youth Institute. The other, Jody, I am happy to receive emails directly, jmulder@fuller.edu. So it's MULDER, jmulder@fuller.edu. And I will give you that so that you can... I'll throw that in the show notes as well. And then if folks wanted to check out the book, which they absolutely should, where should they go for that? Yeah, all one word, futurefocusedchurch.com. Futurefocusedchurch.com will get you the book. And if you can't find it, it should be sold everywhere where books are sold, including Amazon.
Yeah, but don't go there first.
Check out futurefocusedchurch.com.
I'm just kidding. I'll put all those links and stuff in the show notes for you so you can go there and grab them. Jake, thanks, man, so much. Really, I appreciate it. We could talk forever about this. I love this stuff for sure. Thank you. I told you before we jumped on and started recording, but I'll tell you again. And thank you for the work you guys are doing. I've benefited greatly over the years from all of the research and so many of the books, even the ones you mentioned today. And so from me, hear me say, man, I'm thankful and I appreciate you guys so much.
No, thank you. And to those who are listening, please keep up the work. It is important work. It is good work. We believe in you. I'll close with, I really do think the best days of the church and your church can be ahead. So please keep up the work.
I love it. Thanks so much, man. Appreciate it. Well, there you have it. I really enjoyed the interview and that conversation. I think specifically, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but I think so often when we talk about making change, talk about vision, when those conversations happen about the church as a whole, especially the local church, right? Often that's aimed at a senior pastor, senior leader, and kind of we're left often in our role to try to figure out what does that mean for us. And so I just appreciate that conversation so much as we navigate kind of what that looks like from our seat. So hopefully there's a lot of takeaways there for you. Go buy the book. It's incredible. Everything Fuller puts out is heavily researched, very practical. This one is no different. So make sure you head over to the show notes page and check out all of the links and places there that you can find that. Again, just remind you again, head to thelongerhaul.com, jump on the mailing list so that you can find out here as we send some things out here in the next week or so, some fun stuff coming your way. And then, of course, make sure you subscribe to the show. Thanks for listening today, wherever you are. I appreciate you so much for being a part of this thing here we call youth ministry. Thanks for being a part of the Longer Haul community and for being a listener. Stay at it. I promise you're making a difference, even though some days, especially, I know it doesn't feel like it. So we'll catch you in the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Longer Haul Youth Ministry Podcast. Before you go, hit that subscribe button to keep these conversations coming. For notes, resources, and to join our community, swing by thelongerhaul.com. Stay encouraged. Keep making a difference. And remember, we're in this for the longer haul. Catch you on the next episode.